Hello everyone, on behalf of ANROWS, I welcome you to today's webinar, Adolescent Violence in the Home, Prevalence, Service Responses and the Intersection with Disability. I'm Michele Robinson and I'm the Director of Evidence to Action at ANROWS. I acknowledge the country on which we meet today. I am coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation. On behalf of ANROWS, I pay respect to elders past and present. Wherever we are today, we are on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. And I acknowledge and pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session. Before we start the discussion, I'd like to share some housekeeping information. Today's webinar is slightly different to our usual format. We'll be having 3 short research presentations outlining key emerging evidence in the adolescent violence in the home area. Following the presentations, we're going to have a panel discussion with sector experts who will be speaking to promising practice that responds to the issues raised in the research. The panel discussion will be followed by a live Q&A, so send through your questions at any time during the discussion, and the panel will try to answer as many as they can. We've already had hundreds of questions come through the registration process, so we've done our best to incorporate those into the discussion today. The research reports and the resources related to today's topic are going to be shared in the chat. If you would like access to closed captions, please click on the link provided in the chat box now. The webinar will also be recorded and it will be available on the ANROWS website as soon as possible. And you can subscribe to our e-newsletter to be notified when it's available. And this link is also in the chat. Finally, we'll have a survey that'll come up as you exit the webinar. We really appreciate any feedback you'd like to give us on our webinar. Your responses will be very helpful in improving our webinar programs for the future. This is a confronting topic and some participants may find it distressing. It's important to take care of yourself while watching the webinar. If you'd like to access support, please contact 1800-RESPECT on 1800 737 732 or Lifeline on 131114. Adolescent violence in the home, or AVITH as it's sometimes called, is described as a pattern of violent or abusive behaviour used by an adolescent in their family. As we all hear today, adolescents who use violence in the home are often victims and survivors of violence themselves. It's important to remember that given what we know about reporting experiences of violence in general and the lack of safe options for disclosure for young people, it is likely that adolescents are underreporting their own experiences of violence. There is limited research into AVITH in Australia, but ANROWS's most recent grant round enabled a number of research teams to design and carry out projects to address this gap. The projects have endeavoured to understand how policies and services can best be delivered to meet the needs of young people who use violence. There has been huge interest in today's webinar, and many of you have reached out to tell us that this is something that you are really needing in both evidence, support, and guidance on. We hope that today is the first step in providing you with just that. So now let's go to the panel. I'd like to introduce you to today's presenters. Today we'll be having short research presentations from Professor Kate Fitz-Gibbon, who is the Director of the Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre at Monash University, along with Professor Silke Meyer, the Leneen Forde Chair of Child and Family Research at Griffith University. Then we will hear from Associate Professor Georgina Sutherland, who is the Deputy Head of the Disability and Health Unit at the Centre for Health Equity at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health, the University of Melbourne. And lastly, from Elena Campbell, the Associate Director of the Centre for Innovative Justice at RMIT. So now over to you, Kate and Silke.
Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the presentations and the panel discussions. Before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands from where everybody is zooming in. For me, that's the Yagara and the Turrbal people here in Meander in Brisbane, and pay my respects to all elders past, present, and emerging, including everyone joining us online today. Now to the technical challenges. I will share my screen and hopefully this will work. So as Michelle said, Kate and I will start with an overview. I'll start with a brief overview. We conducted a project on young people's use and experiences of violence in the home in Australia in a sample of over 5,000 young people in Australia. And the study looked at experiences and use of violence in the home, as well as impacts and support needs. I'll start with a brief overview of some of the nature and extent and prevalence findings before handing over to Kate for a more in-depth and qualitative discussion of young people's support needs. So I would like to acknowledge also to start with, of course, the ANROWS funding round that has made this project possible. And then I guess equally important, the victim survivor voices, the young people. As I said, we had over 5,000 young people participating in this survey. And a large number of the young people provided very generous, detailed, written, qualitative feedback in addition to the standard quantitative survey measure answers. So this project wouldn't have been possible, and we wouldn't have had the insights that we were able to generate on young people's use of violence and its intersection with experiences of violence in the home if it hadn't been for young people's generosity and commitment to having a voice. I also want to acknowledge my Monash and Australian Institute of Criminology colleagues on this project, Professor Kate Fitz-Gibbon, who will be presenting next, but also Professor Jane Marie Meyer, Professor Stephen Roberts, Dr. Hayley Boxall from the AIC, and Dr. Catherine Bernier from Monash. So the research design, as I said, it was a national survey. It was facilitated via social survey panels, and the focus of the survey was on 3 categories of experiences or use of violence in the home, and we measured the same forms, nature and extent, frequency, and types of violence in each of these categories, including, and I say witnessing, in inverted commas, experiencing violence in the home between other family members, being subjected to direct forms of child abuse other than experiencing domestic and family violence between other family members, and then young people's own use of violence on a spectrum similar to what we see in the personal safety survey in terms of non-physical and physical types of abuse, threats, property damage. We also asked survey respondents detailed information in addition to their characteristics about their help seeking around the different experiences and use of violence and their support needs. You'll see from Kate and my findings that a lot of that is quite interlinked, because when young people try to make sense of their use of violence, much of that was in the context of experiencing violence. So very often their help-seeking, disclosure and support needs experiences are not clear-cut in terms of, or are often interconnected in terms of their underlying experiences of trauma and the intergenerational transmission of violence. So just a brief overview of the survey. We had about 2/3 of young people that identified as female at birth, with one third roughly identifying as male at birth. We had 4% of young people identifying as gender diverse or gender questioning, and we had almost 1/3 of young people identifying as with diverse sexual orientation, so non-heterosexual young people. And I think this is important to keep in mind, partly because we had some priority cohort findings in the survey, but also because it really shows the implications for service delivery and unique service tailoring towards diverse populations, including LGBTQIA+ young people. We had 5% that identified as First Nations young people, 10% that identified as coming from a non-English speaking background. We had over 1/3 of young people identifying as living with a disability. And again, this plays into some of the priority cohort findings. And then we had in terms of the distribution of geographic locations, we had a slight overrepresentation of metropolitan young people, slight underrepresentation of regional areas, and then the Australian standard in terms of 2% of young people living in remote areas. In terms of the findings, and these are really just some of the key findings, as Michele said, the detailed reports and results are shared via the relevant links. So we had just over half of young people in the survey who reported having experienced childhood trauma in form of experiencing domestic and family violence between other family members and or being the direct target of abuse and neglect. And as you see from these bubbles here, the largest proportion of those, just over 50%, were 28% of young people that had both experienced growing up with domestic and family violence between other family members and other direct forms of abuse, followed by 23% of young people that said they had grown up with domestic violence between other family members but never been the direct target of abuse. And then 2% who said they were the direct target of abuse, but no other experiences of DV in the household growing up. I think the main thing about these statistics really is the small bubble of the 2%, which really shows us that when there's allegations or notifications or suspicions of child abuse and neglect in families, it's almost always safe to assume that there's also domestic and family violence somewhere, either historical or ongoing in the background, whereas that wasn't necessarily the case for young people growing up with DV between other family members, but not being the direct target of other types of abuse or maltreatment. In terms of the intergenerational transmission of violence, 1 in 2 young people with childhood experiences, to start with, 1 in 5 young people in the survey reported having used AVITH in the home towards other family members at some stage. 1 in 2 young people with childhood experiences reported using violence in the home. And so I guess what we can say, well, that's 1 in 2 young people, meaning 50% turn out to not be subject to an intergenerational transmission of violence. When we looked at the ones that started using violence in the home and did so on a frequent pattern, 9 in 10 young people had grown up with experiences of domestic and family violence and or other forms of maltreatment. I just want to quickly touch on the priority cohort observations without going into any of the statistics. We looked at different priority cohorts, but in particular the LGBTQIA+ young people and young people who identified as living with at least one disability were significantly more likely to report that they had used violence in the home towards other family members. When we then examined their intersection with childhood experiences of domestic and family violence and or other forms of abuse, these priority cohorts of young people were also all disproportionately more likely to have experienced both domestic and family violence and other forms of maltreatment. So really what that told us was that the increased risk of AVITH in the home by some cohorts of young people, or in general, I guess the increased risk of using violence in the home really needs to be regarded and understood and responded to in the context of childhood victimization. I'll hand over to Kate.
Thank you so much, Silke. If you could just stop sharing, then I'll share.
That would be good, wouldn't it?
No worries. Thank you so much. So continuing on with findings from the same study, I'm going to focus on the data that we had around who young people disclosed their experiences to, as well as what their support needs were. The survey was designed in a way that allowed us to ask both quantitatively who they had disclosed to, if anyone, but also what supports they were seeking when they made that disclosure. Given the nature of the survey, but also the relative young age of our participants, we wanted to keep these questions quite simple. We asked, did you tell anyone? Who did you tell? who was the most helpful person that you told and who was the least helpful. And this data here focuses specifically on that sub-cohort who had used family violence in the home. We found that 1 in 3 young people disclosed their use of violence to a family member, and then within this, they were most likely to tell their mum. Following that, they were most likely to tell a sibling or their father. There was approximately 1 in 5, just under 18% of young people who had disclosed their experiences to a friend, and then just under 10% had disclosed to a formal service provider. Just a flag of the young people, sorry, in our study, there were only 20 young people, so 2% of this cohort of adolescents who were using violence in the home that had been reported to their police for these behaviours. We see this as a really positive thing. We don't want punitive responses to young people in this context, particularly given what is known that these are people who are victim survivors in their own right, first and foremost. So we were really pleased to see that the police intervention and police reporting was extremely low for this cohort. When we asked who was the most helpful person, there was a range of individuals that were identified, but certainly a very predominant pattern that the majority of young people, they identified their mother as the most helpful person that they told about their own use of domestic and family violence. This was particularly so for the young girls in our study. And here a number of young girls spoke about their mother as understanding and being sympathetic to their experience of using violence. We also saw that a number of young people were grateful that their mum had been able to explain to them why they were using family violence, and it helped them to find that understanding. Because in our study, we had a number of young people who also identified that their mother was a victim survivor as well. So within their qualitative comments here, they also said how when they disclosed their mum, they shared firsthand knowledge around their experiences. And you can see a number of the quotes here on the left from some of our participants around why mum was the most helpful. The next person cited after this was a sibling, and then for a lesser portion of people, a father. For those that cited their friend as the most helpful, there was a small subsection, and they really spoke about friends as being understanding and as providing that space to hold their experience and to validate it. In terms of who was the least helpful person, really, there was a range of different people that were cited here, but what was really clear from the responses that we received was that the categorisation as someone as least helpful was because they had failed to take any action or to suggest any action, or they had simply ignored the disclosure or excused the situation that had been disclosed to them. Young people really spoke about the importance of feeling validated when they disclose an experience of violence, be it one that they've experienced themselves or be it one where they have used violence. That was incredibly important to them. We had a small number of young people in this study who expressed feeling guilty or feeling regret for having disclosed their experience because that disclosure hadn't led to a helpful intervention or a point of validation. In terms of the study's findings around service and support needs, these seem quite obvious, and in many ways they are. They're quite simplistic. Young people in our study wanted a safe space or a place that they could go to that took them away from the violence in their family home. They wanted someone to talk to. They wanted professional support, and it wasn't always clear to them where they would get that professional support. We also had a number of findings around the importance of education about abusive behaviours as well as their impacts, as well as the importance of a supportive school environment. We also saw that a number of victim survivors within this study who had been using violence in the home spoke about the connection and the importance of a supportive and understanding mother figure in their lives. To look at that very briefly in a little bit more detail around a safe place to go, which was the most commonly listed type of support for young people. Really, this was linked in two ways. It was about the desire to be able to seek respite from whatever was happening at home. So it wasn't always that they wanted a permanent safe space, but they wanted somewhere to go which could create that break. And I think this was particularly significant given that at the time we were collecting this data, it was during a period of time when a number of Australian states were going in and out of COVID-19 stay-at-home restrictions. So for a lot of young people, that place to go to seek respite had been taken away from them. There was, though, a number of young people in the study who wanted to leave home permanently and wanted to find a safe alternative housing or carer arrangement, and that wasn't immediately apparent to them how they would do that. So I think it's really important for us to critically consider how we offer housing supports and care arrangements for children that are seeking that away from a parental figure. In terms of the second most common support around having someone to talk to, the key thing to flag here was that what young people found helpful about having someone to talk to was where that person could provide information and validation of their experience. They wanted someone who would actively listen to them. This wasn't seen as a passive interaction. They wanted someone that was really engaged. They had really clear expectations as well around what it meant to disclose, particularly to a trusted adult, and thinking here around adult family members, but also adults, teachers within schooling environment. We had a number of young people who expressed quite significant frustration and hurt when their disclosures to a trusted adult had been ignored and not acted upon. I'm conscious of time, so I won't speak too long on this, but it was really apparent to us that young people saw school as a really key point where an intervention could occur, and that they wanted to see schools take a more proactive approach to inquiring about individual student wellbeing and to providing those supports, be it through an on-site counsellor or a psychologist, to students that are experiencing domestic and family violence. There are a range of different policy and practice implications from this study. It really revealed significant gaps in our current responses to adolescent violence in the home, as well as the underlying need for a whole of system suite of tailored, trauma-informed and domestic and family violence aware interventions. But beyond anything, something that Silke and I have kind of been constantly emphasising through this work is that children must be responded to as victim survivors of domestic and family violence in their own right. And first and foremost, even where they are using violence in the home, and that might come to the attention first. So thank you so much. Here's the link to our study, which I know is very long, so we'll pop that in the Q&A also. I now have the absolute honour to pass you on to Georgina Sutherland.
Thank you, Kate. I'll just share my screen now before I start. Okay, yeah, thanks again, Kate, and to Silke. Such important foundational work in this space in Australia. And I think, as you emphasised right at the end, is an important point of connection, I think, between these presentation todays and then perhaps for the panel to consider is the way in which we start to deconstruct that very rigid binary around who's using violence and who is the subject of violence that has really underpinned so much of our responses in family and domestic violence to date. My name is Georgina. I'm here at the University of Melbourne. I'm joining you today from Melbourne, which is the colonial name for the city where I live, and I would like to acknowledge them. I'm on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to First Nations people joining the seminar today, or the webinar. I'd also like to acknowledge the co-investigators and the broader research team on this who brought a multidisciplinary but also a lived experience perspective to this study. There was also, there's a lot of other people to thank. We started with a reasonably small, quite formal advisory group who started us off initially with the project, but actually it grew quite organically from there, and we engaged with loads of people over the course of the project. Some sort of communities of practice that we could see were happening already. We reached out, people reached in. They made us think really deeply about this issue, questioned us a lot, challenged us, particularly thinking about who holds the power in the research process, who has a voice, whose voice is included and whose isn't there. And it was really, really good exercise for us throughout the project. We also want to extend our thanks, of course, to the people who shared their stories with us, some of them pretty difficult stories to tell about themselves and their families and about their professional practice as well. I just wanted to briefly, just a brief note in terms of the background. And I had this titled as background and challenges, and I kept changing what I would call this, but actually what it is some of the challenges that sat in the background. So how are we guided in our approach to this research? And we know that negative attitudes towards young people with disability and the associated stigma shapes young people's lives in really powerful ways. So the questions that we were challenged by others about, and the question that we challenged ourselves about, was how do we undertake research in this space, or research that explores young people's use of violence in the way that does not further contribute to stigmatisation? And part of the answer to that was, how do we understand and communicate about risk? And I apologise, I feel like this is maybe off the screen for people, but research about AVITH often does collapse disability into a binary classification, so whether people are disabled or not. It doesn't always use international best practice. So we find that different groups of people are identified as disability in some research and not in others. And then that positions disability as a risk factor for violence. And the byproduct of this framing, often really unintentionally, is that disability is considered as an inherent characteristic, rather than thinking about disability as the behaviours and the interactional context, or the social and interactional context in which those behaviours arrive. And so what we see here is that our understanding of disability has really material consequences then for policies and practices. I'll just talk a bit about what I did, and for some reason my slides also are stuck. Oh, here we go. What we did. An exploratory qualitative research. We're looking at generating some new knowledge about this really unexplored area. We collected data through in-depth semi-structured interviews with mothers who had experienced AVITH. Our call out to participants was very broad. We asked for parents, carers, we're inclusive of sort of all forms of parenthood, but only mums. We only got mums who responded to us. And practitioners with direct experience working with young people with disability. As Kate alluded to, we were also undertaking this study throughout Melbourne's second really long lockdown. So lots of challenges, but one of the key challenges was about engaging with young people with disability, which we didn't do in this case, and we recognise that as a really critical missing piece of this work. So we spoke to mums. We spoke to 11 mums about young people with disability who were using violence, and to 2 mums who talked to us about their children when they're adults, and they talked to us about their experiences when their children were young. They were a pretty diverse group in terms of cultural backgrounds. They were dispersed across Victoria. We were using Zoom as our mechanism for collecting data. Single parent households mostly, but not all. Also raising siblings, different types of employment, and around half also identified as having a disability, psychosocial disability, mostly related to anxiety, depression, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The young people that they talked to us about were between the ages of 8 and 21. Most of the people were male or male identifying. They mostly were receiving NDIS supports. Mums talked to us about that the young person had complex needs for support, mostly in the context of co-occurring neurodevelopmental, intellectual and psychosocial disability. So the people, these young people weren't the type of people who would be able to respond to a survey. So we're talking about quite a different group here than what would have appeared in the survey that Kate and Silke were describing earlier. We also talked to practitioners, 16 practitioners, working across lots of different sectors. They worked with families, with young people, and with their siblings as well. They're also quite dispersed across Victoria, and all but one practitioner was female, and I think that's probably pretty accurate representation of the workforce. I won't go, this is a slide that talks generally about experiences for families, and I won't go in detail because I think that's something that we know quite a lot about, including that the experiences can be complex and that often have been part of families' lives for a very long time. What mums did speak to us about a lot was about feeling shamed, feeling stigma, feeling alone, isolated and abandoned. And this is what we heard consistently through the project. And this is a quote from one mum who says, there's probably a lot more behaviour and stuff that goes on. that people don't ever find out about, because it's embarrassing to say, look, I'm pretty much controlled by my 16-year-old so he can feel safe. And in the meantime, he yells abuse at me, punches holes in the walls. I mean, you're not going to go around telling people stuff like that. It's a very lonely and isolated place to be. In line with what Kate and Silke had talked about, one of the predominant presenting themes that both mums and practitioners talked about was the presence of violence and abuse for young people with disability. And that was both within and beyond the boundaries of family life. So both past experiences of adult perpetrated violence in the home, mums frequently identified as victim survivors to domestic and family violence. Mums also talked to us a lot about this sort of violence, discrimination, marginalisation for their young person with disability at school, in other educational settings, in their engagement with services. So this idea of discrimination was really a large part and present for young people with disability in terms of their day-to-day lives. All the participants, mums and practitioners, noted that this backdrop of violence was significant and had complex impacts for young people, for families, and for service providers. So it makes things really tricky. Another commonly occurring theme for us was, and this might perhaps look different to other groups of young people, is that there's a high level of unmet needs, but often in the context of extensive service engagement. So this is what one of the mums talked to us about. She said that she felt like her family was a pincushion under the spotlight of services. And then she went on to say, like, I don't mind if it's coordinated and makes sense, but services and systems are operating in silos and none of them talk to each other very well. So we know from prior research with children and young people who are using harmful behaviours at home that they do tend to have contact with a greater range of services than other children and for a greater period of time. And that was certainly what we heard in our project. But that services were struggling to meet the needs of young people, and particularly noticed as a shortcoming among practitioners themselves and the mums who were sort of managing the service engagement about a lack of disability inclusive practices, particularly in the specialised domestic and family violence services, but equally a lack of literacy around family and domestic violence in specialist disability services. And of course, the young people are using this with disability and their families are using this really broad range of services that might look a little bit different for other children and young people. We also heard about asking for help can make things worse. So there are certainly pockets of good practice. We heard about really exemplary responses from police, from domestic and family violence services, from hospitals, but for mums it really stood out as a norm, as different from the norm, because they were much more used to engaging with services and systems where their perceptions of them were overly negative. And there's a quote here that I can't even quite read, so I'm just going to move that a little bit. And this one says we were asking for help, begging for help, and that service response, well, it would have to be a prison cell because we have nowhere for him to go. They told us the only way we would get help would be to have him admitted to hospital and for you to refuse to pick him up, or if he entered the criminal justice system. So you can see how services and systems can and do contribute to trauma. Every time I move this, I can't move my slides then. I won't go into a great deal about the next two because I think that they're probably covered by what Elena's going to speak about. And this is often the rigid models of service provision that's centred on adult perpetrated violence are not helpful in this case. And we found that also to be true, that there's limited strategies, skills and funding models, particularly to support parents in this case who will continue to live with someone who is using violence at home. And one of the practitioners talked about there is particularly some types of services that if a parent or a victim survivor chooses, oh, now I've lost that quote. If the person who's using violence in the home, if they still want to live together essentially, then they've been refused services if the person who's using violence is still there. The final one is the role of the NDIS. An important, we heard from both mums and practitioners that this is a really important component of a multi-sectoral response and is currently not well integrated. And there's often a lack of visibility about support for young people and for families about using harmful behaviours at home. So again, like Kate and Silke, ours was a pretty big report. It is available. That was just sort of some of the key findings, and I'll stop my sharing and I'll pass over to Elena as our last project.
Thanks so much, Georgina, and thanks to Kate and Silke and to ANROWS. My name's Elena Campbell. I'm an Associate Director at the CIJ. I'm calling in from Boonwurrung country down on the sunny south coast of Victoria, and it's fantastic to be here today to talk to you about a project that started out as intended to be a pretty targeted project, falling out of a prior recommendation from our prior piece of research from the PIPA project. As these things tend to happen, a targeted piece that was supposed to be looking at one recommendation became once again a system-wide focus. But I just want to, this is called Wraparound Families Experiencing AVITH Towards a Collaborative Service Response, because we were responding to a recommendation in our PIPA project that families experiencing this challenge really need a wraparound service response that brings in different services, but also looks at the needs of the whole family. So I just want to acknowledge my collaborators listed there on that first slide. So just quickly to give you a sense of what the project involved. It had a brief literature scan. We had practitioner focus groups with over 75 practitioners. We had a case study of an existing program that was funded by the federal government, which included client interviews and case file reviews, and then co-production workshops with those practitioners to test and find a draft framework, because what our objective from this project was not kind of a series of recommendations, which is a standard approach for most research pieces. It was a framework that could be picked up and considered by different jurisdictions, different organisations, practitioners from all around Australia or potentially elsewhere, and be applicable or take elements from regardless of where they were in the AVITH service response journey. But the key challenges that we had, like Georgina, we were, and obviously like Kate and Silke, but Kate and Silke's study was a national one, but we were conducting this throughout Victoria's extended lockdown. So we were very, very grateful for an extraordinary level of engagement from the practitioners who just persisted in joining our focus groups and workshops over and over again as we went into great depth about language and terminology. But more significantly, COVID had a really big impact on the case study because of the nature of service delivery and working with young people and families was really, really constrained during that time. And so there were sort of only certain limitations, certain things that the service could do. But that in turn told us a lot about what was needed, as we'll show you. A lot of the things, I'll sort of try and not be conscious of time, and so obviously some of these themes have been covered already, but what we're interested to see is whether there had been any movement, because when we first looked at this concept in 2017, it was 2017, it was just after the Royal Commission in Victoria, where we've had a few services funded to respond to AVITH since about 2014, but it was still a fairly growing area. And we found that increasingly families were self-referring, but that stigma and shame, which was really illustrated by a lot of those quotes from the two previous studies, really was holding people back, as was a sort of an uncertainty about what behaviours actually crossed the line or constituted AVITH or constituted a reason for help seeking, acknowledging that fear of the system response is always the biggest reason for holding back, which is certainly what we found in our PIPA project. But we also found that the service response has been conventionally geared to victim, survivor, perpetrator dichotomy, or to response to adult perpetration. So services were still struggling, or the broader system in particular actually, to sort of struggle with someone who was using harmful behaviours, but had also experienced violence themselves. And all of that confusion and the lack of kind of considered and consistent conceptualisation were either leading to late or inappropriate referrals, with the system uncertain about how to respond. And at that particular time in Victoria, service funding was still for very short-term and individualised work rather than whole of family work. And that, of course, as we all know, every practitioner and or service provider on the call will know that short-term funding also limits practice and workforce development, because you're always turning over. We saw, in terms of the presenting needs, across the case file review that we did, adult perpetration was a feature in young people's lives in 88%. And across the data, but I want to really, really highlight that where this research came down is like really wanting to emphasise that we've recognised that young people have using AVITH usually have prior experiences of family violence, but this one was a big one in terms of current and ongoing adult perpetrated harm. Potentially, our system has assumed that it's been addressed because the system has stepped in and separated people, but not taking account of harm that is still being perpetrated on the sidelines through the family law process and other systems abuse. So that's a real challenge for services when they're trying to maintain a lens on that, but they're only funded to work with a young person, or potentially they can try and work with mum, but they're not quite sure how to engage with the fact that there's an original perpetrator, as we tend to frame it, undermining some therapeutic work on the side, withholding consent, and just generally contributing to young people's feelings of guilt and rejection. We saw mothers' experiences of trauma and shame, a co-occurrence of disability, which we identified really broadly. And again, our PIPA project has explored that in more depth. And there was a question in the Q&As I noticed about that. Diverse and co-occurring, why can't I say that word, trauma experiences was really prevalent. So I just want to highlight that, yes, adult perpetrated harm was the biggest, but migration and refugee trauma, very severe parental mental ill health, bereavement, separation because to do with issues of a parent's illness, child removal, adoption, were all contributing to the real sense of traumatized and shattered family relationships. And then one of the things that surprised us actually was the prevalence of bullying, victimisation. And it's not really too sort of big of a leap to understand that if you're copying it at school, then potentially when you come home, as we know, children will act out where they feel safe. And that's the same when children go to dad in the separated parent situation, dad's using harm, they're not going to use that behaviour at dad's, but they're going to come home and pay out on mum, which is what we hear over and over again in this area. But to the system, and that's what I'm here to talk about. In particular, we heard very much about the challenge of families either being underserviced, so falling through the cracks completely, or being overserviced. And I think it was Georgina, that quote in Georgina's presentation that talked about feeling like pincushion under the microscope. And so families just were feeling overwhelmed and passed on in a sort of relay or assess and refer on model, which is not the fault of practitioners. It's the way the system is funded and designed. But also weirdly, that relay contributes to services and agencies closing once they feel like another service is holding the risk, even where they might have a key role to play, but the information not always following families. So of course, mum has to tell the story over and over again. Now, care teams, we went into this assuming that care teams were just a kind of going to be a well-functioning collaborative mechanisms, because that's what we were looking for, collaboration. But what we found was, again, there were a lot of kind of limitations or constraints where there might be a lack of clarity around the care team purpose. There might be a cast of thousands and everyone has a different idea about why they're there and who the main client is, who needs to be involved, what role each service plays, and who's actually taking the lead. and coordinating. So everyone might agree to a particular activity and then go away, but nobody's necessarily tasked with following that up. We heard about system overwhelm and sort of kind of compassion fatigue, where people are feeling like, well, there's really only so much I can do because I'm completely overwhelmed. My caseload is ridiculous, so I'm just going to do this. And so there was often we heard about a lack of accountability to the young person or the family, rather than, so the focus was always on how are we going to hold this young person to account. So we did see lots of examples of promising practice emerging. And I want to acknowledge again that this was a couple of years ago. So that practice has been, I'm sure, kind of accelerating at a rate of knots during this time, and particularly in Victoria after a really big funding investment. But what we saw was move away from stigmatising language. So when I first started doing this work, I remember doing presentations to audiences and about young people's use of AVITH, and someone would come up to me and say, oh, I noticed you use the word children or young people and not perpetrators. I was like, yeah, that is because that's who they are. But that's a real kind of shift in our language, and talking about using violence and using harmful behaviours is a really important thing, because families will feel particularly worried about reaching out for support from a service that is really labelled as being about family violence. We saw services looking more broadly at young person's behaviours as the violence or the use of violence as a symptom, as one symptom or signal of distress. And as various services said, if a young person's using violence, that's information, that's telling us something. We heard about the role of readiness, how it's super, super important to just, rather than impose an intervention and expect it to work, do an assessment and try to understand what families and young people are ready for. Looking at the whole family system, including that adult perpetration, but other experiences of harm, and reducing stress and distress within the family, and that includes understanding parents' own experiences of trauma. We heard about the flexibility to respond to the breadth of factors, so that might be contributing to AVITH, reducing that overwhelm, and being guided by young people and families' needs, not the needs of the system. And I think there were examples that Georgina spoke about, and Kate and Silke, where negative service interactions are key. If a young person has gone and reached out for help, and either somebody hasn't done something or their trust has not been protected, that has a huge impact on their willingness to engage again, and contributes to that, that myth and myth conception that young people are difficult to engage. They're not difficult to engage. They just need to be engaged with differently in a way that builds trust. Or restores any trust that they might have had. That includes, a hugely important role of outreach and working in a different way, working over a longer period of time, and using brokerage in flexible ways to provide respite. I think we were talking about respite before, or providing shared activities or supports to siblings, which might make a difference in the family environment. And just generally building positive engagement, where previously their shared identity has been built around experiences of harm.
Elena, we have about a minute.
Sure. Okay. So I think I've covered that. So what we found is a really promising sign of, reflective practice and emerging collaboration coming out, recognition of AVITH as a specialisation. But what we did, and this is where I'll throw to you we'll put it in the chat, is develop a detailed, this is the framework on a slide of our AVITH collaborative practice framework, which contains 4 pillars and then principles and enablers, which spell out what policymakers, organisations, and then individual practitioners need to do or consider to think about how they might work more effectively in this area. And we've held practitioner workshops in Victoria to unpack these a bit, and we hope that we'll be able to continue that through a series of workshops. But I really invite everyone to have a look and see that wherever you are, there will be something in it for you. Thanks very much, Michele.
Thanks so much, Elena. Thanks to you, Kate and Silke and Georgina as well. That it's a critical program of research that you've all developed for us. We're now joined by a panel of experts to help us draw out the implications of the evidence for both policy and practice. And it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome the panel. Meena Singh. So everyone is going to turn their cameras on. Are we all great? Wonderful. Meena Singh, who is the Victorian Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People. Ali Butchers, who is a family violence lawyer at Youth Law. Silvana Achifa, the General Manager of Family Services at Drummond Street Services, and Brianna Waugh, a young consultant with the Create Foundation. Welcome, everybody. So let's go to our first question for the panel. From what we have just heard, it really stands out from across the projects that the evidence is telling us that a whole of family approach or system is critical. Silvana, in your work at Drummond Street, and you can also touch on the fact that you were part of the research project with Elena, what does this mean to you?
Thanks, Michele. And it's exciting to have all that evidence building in this space as well. I guess for Drummond Street, our strong focus, as was evident in the research, was about an intersectional and a trauma lens, and not just for the young person, but really for the whole of family. So our work really focuses on incorporating a lot of that intersectionality and looking at what the impacts are on them and what they are dealing with and how that impacts the whole situation. So are they experiencing family violence? Are they from a cold background, gender questioning, having economic, financial issues, living with a disability, trauma, and intergenerational trauma, as we just saw in all the research? And I guess at Drummond Street, it really is about holding an attitude of curiosity, which is not sort of a language that we use a lot in the sector, but it seems to be a really important component in actually informing how we do an intake and broadening it out beyond just the focus on the young person and ensuring that it also looks at the whole of the family. So often siblings who may be just as invisible in this situation and how everyone is being impacted by this. And we also do this to ensure that we don't misidentify and really look at all the factors. So that it starts really from the very get-go in regards to our intake processes and our assessment process. I think also for us, we also get a lot of our referrals from within our family services. So rather than go and spruiking for AVITH clients, they're coming to us indirectly through family services where they've come in to deal with a young person who is presenting as having behavioural issues, or there's an issue with a young person who has a disability. And so families have come to us, and it takes some sessions before they actually disclose that AVITH is actually happening in the home. But the rapport and the development of that relationship has already begun. And that may come through our group programs, it may come through our youth services, it comes from a whole range of our services in Drummond Street. So those referral pathways are really needing to be less AVITH specific. So it's not just coming through our good companions through youth law, but other sort of internal or other service who understand what we provide. And then I guess what that means is really looking at working with all the family to work through what is actually happening for them. So, and that may be at times some parenting skills. It may at times be actually dealing with the dynamics that are playing out within the family. It's certainly working with the young person if they're around, but we always take whatever is presented to us. So that may mean working with mum. If mum is the only person, then really look at engaging with mum and providing some support to empower them. And often others will come. So it might be siblings who come and join in. And I think also, if I may just say, I think it also impacts on how we then provide services. Yeah. So it means often having a capacity to work with the young person themselves. So our AVITH worker might work with them, but it may also mean engaging with the family. So the parents, an individual parent, at times a whole family group when it's safe to do so. And so having that flexibility and those skill sets to work across all of that.
Yeah. And is that a pivoting for the service? Is this something new?
Yeah, that takes a lot of coordination. And certainly we've had to work very hard in developing even our own internal collaborative practices, as the research sort of suggested in Elena's work. So there's been a lot of work in how we coordinate ourselves internally, how we hold dynamic risk, how we and continually assess that and manage that, how we incorporate other components of the service. So do we need to do a secondary consultation with some of our Q space, our LGBTQI, where children or young people are identifying that their gender is maybe, or their transitioning is maybe a part of what's affecting. It might be about working with some of our peer workers around culture or being a person of colour, or it may be about trauma and supporting parents who they themselves have identified trauma. So there's a whole range of even our tools for assessing. So that binary model that I think many of the presenters today have talked about, we can't just talk about victims and perpetrators. These young people often experience both. So our tools of assessment are constantly being reviewed. We are MARAM aligned in Victoria, but it really is about constantly assessing how best to ask those questions to get the full picture. And that's tricky. That is constantly evolving and tricky, and that requires that Drummond Street does pivot, does explore, does challenge itself, and builds a workforce that can respond to that. And that's perhaps the other factor. I think post-COVID, we've all had a lot of issues around recruitment, but it's even more complex in this work because we're not looking for a family worker and we're not looking for a specific youth worker. We're looking for someone who feels comfortable navigating both those sectors of work, which traditionally have been separate. So finding staff and that workforce capacity is really quite tricky and requires a lot of input from the agency as well.
And across agencies, I can imagine.
And across it. And look, I'm just talking about our own service, but we have to work with other agencies. And so that collaboration then extends out. And so having worked with youth law, having worked with other services, and again, I think as it's been raised, at times we have to stop and consider, are we over-servicing? What's our component? Well, if a family is well resourced, what's our component? Are we going to just provide some parenting support and leave the rest to other agencies? Or do we hold back until some mental health intervention has happened, for example, and then pick up and do some collaborative work in that space? So it's not neat and tidy, I think, and it's a new way potentially of working for many agencies.
And the collaborative practice framework is something that everybody on the call can have a look at, and it's very helpful in this regard. Turning to you, Ali, at Youth Law, and this is something that you also have to think about really carefully, that multi-directional support. Did you want to chime in here and talk about how you do your work?
Yeah, sure. I echo everything Sylvana's just said. We do a lot of work with Drummond Street. From the work that we do, obviously we're having young people come to us when they're really getting to the pointy end of things and they found themselves at court, whether that's because an intervention order has been taken out against them, or they might also have criminal charges. And, AVITH it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's never no context for it. So it's absolutely important to, sort of take a step back and look at what's going on in the broader family dynamic, what needs changing, what do the family need help with, support with to enforce. But it also is a time where that young person really does need that specific support. And I think it is important that they do get some really specific support that they're asking for. Something we do hear quite a bit from young people is that, particularly if the family has sort of been engaged with services for a little bit, and for whatever reason the young person hasn't come to the table, or they have and then have sort of dropped off, a common theme we do hear is that they sort of feel as though the narrative or what's been said to support services has been from a parent, usually protective parent, which is often mum, and they don't feel that mum's telling the whole side of the story or not sharing enough of their story, or mum's saying, I think, this this would be really helpful. And they're sort of saying, well, actually, I don't think that would be helpful. This is also what's going on from my perspective. And I think they do need to be given the opportunity to speak, tell their own story and advocate for themselves. Because they are often a lot more aware and attuned, perhaps, than maybe they sort of spoken up from the past. So if you give them the opportunity to do that, a lot of them will be quite clear about what they feel that they need to sort of make some changes. And it's unfortunate that they end up at the pointy end and at court, but sometimes it is a way that sort of really brings them out of the woodwork and convinces them to get engaged, because they sort of have to if they want a better legal outcome. So.
That's a really nice segue into to you, Brianna, the idea of young people needing to tell their own story. You're a youth consultant with the Create Foundation, advocating for safety and support for young people who've experienced out-of-home care. Can you tell us about why it's important to include the voices of young people when designing and running services? And how do we engage in good practice? What does that look like?
So for a lot of us, we will have different experiences, and getting to understand different individuals' perspective on what we need, what we feel will help us is important. Every generation's going to go through different things, and what might have worked for you or I won't work for the next generation. You know, I've found from my own experience, it feels very much that services are a 9 to 5. After that time, what is there for us if we're going through something? How am I going to regulate my emotions when I have no one else to reach out to? If I'm not feeling safe in my house or, you know, in my wherever I am, who am I going to go to? It feels online services, they'll listen to your bit and then they'll say, right, that's good, we recommend you go see a psychiatrist. So after 5 p.m, you have authorities who will either detain you, arrest you, you'll be in court the next day, or you'll have the hospitals who will, they'll admit you, of course, no problems, but that's temporary. We need something that's long lasting. And, you know, somewhere to go and just feel like, okay, even if I'm not going to disclose what I've done or what's happening in my life, somewhere I can just de-stress. And, you know, taking that on board and listening to what young people need is important. How are you going to tailor services to them if you aren't taking on board what they feel that's going to suit them?
Absolutely. And Mina, I might just see if you'd like to add to that in terms of the work that you do. I mean, and so much of what you just said, Brianna, corroborates and reinforces the findings from all of the research that we've heard about this morning. So how do you include the voice of the child and young people, Mina?
Yeah, so at the Commission for Children and Young People, we are very much focused on making sure we have children and young people with experiences of the systems that we're deeply engaged in, so child protection, children and young people in out-of-home care and youth justice, that we get their voices to inform what work we do. So one clear example of is our Youth Advisory Committee that is made up of young people with lived experience of those systems, and who better to tell us what to change in a system and how it works than people who have that first-hand experience of what's happened to them. And we work from the right that's enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that says that children and young people should be included in decision-making about them. And what we see in our very specific focuses of child protection and youth justice is just how many decisions are made about children and young people without their input and without their understanding. We see use of family violence or by adolescents always in that context of having first been a victim of family violence in the home. The systems that we work in are the tertiary systems where lots of failings has happened for the family, for the child. And sadly, we see that the first response to, or the first real attempt at responding to the experience of family violence as a victim for a child or a young person is responding to their use of family violence. So that's the thing that gets the attention, the punitive response, the criminal response, and the irony of their trauma being remotely considered in that space when it really needed to be addressed from the word go. And we do systemic inquiries. We did one a few years ago about children who experienced family violence and were in the child protection system who had passed away, and looking at just the numerous holes in and gaps in service delivery. And the one of the researchers gave that really vivid visualization of being the pincushion under a spotlight. It's sometimes feels like there can be so many spotlights or so many people that know about what's happening in a family, but not enough is stepping up and filling the gaps in terms of what the service delivery needs to be. And specifically for children and young people. And there is so much intersectionality, when we look at, particularly when we're talking about the kids that come into child protection's remit, who are removed from their families and placed in out-of-home care, we see so much intersection of race, of identity, of disability, of a whole range of different things. So we really, we need services that really put the child and young person front and centre and are actually hearing what they're talking about and what Silvana's talking about. We need to think differently about our services. A lot of what we see works well is when a child or young person has a person or a space that they can trust, and that trust is built before the need arises. Yeah. And we've seen some fantastic examples in, we're doing an education inquiry at the moment into education experiences for children and young people in out-of-home care. Seen some amazing examples of that, where there are workers and specialists and people in school settings, often alternative school settings, that provide those extra supports and extra services that children and young people know they can go to and talk about the challenges that they're facing and the circumstances that they're in.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful and a great segue. Thank you, Mina. Ali, that's coming back to you around support service and the service system. Even once someone is in court and we've moved beyond prevention and early intervention, what is the importance of a support service at that point?
Oh, it's so important. I mean, one of the legal things that gets considered is when making, for example, intervention orders is, what's the risk that this behaviour is going to continue? And if we can show that that risk is mitigated somehow, ideally by the young person, because unfortunately, by the time they're at court, the lens is really on them, but that there's been some meaningful engagement with support services. And, hopefully added to that is that the family is also being supportive in the background, then that can really ease the concerns of the court that, look, okay, well, these things are in place and they are working well, and there isn't really a need for an intervention order anymore, which is what we would always want. A breach of an intervention order can become criminal, and we always want to avoid young people entering the criminal justice system unnecessarily. So having support, even just because they've reached the court point, it's more crucial. It's not too late. It can make a massive difference to the outcome of their legal matter.
Mm. And you mentioned earlier that you work closely with Drummond Street Services. What does the collaboration look like?
It depends. Sometimes we're referring to them.
Or more broadly, not just
us. Yeah, I mean, we're in a really unique space. One thing, as Mina said, often these young people, a lot of decisions have been made without their involvement. Some of them think it's quite cool when they come to us and we explain that, well, the law says they can actually instruct their own lawyer at that age that they're coming to us. And so that means there's no parent involvement if they don't want there to be. And they're the ones sort of calling the shots, and everything's private and confidential. So that is a really nice way sometimes to get them to tell a bit more of their story, because they feel like it's not going to be repeated elsewhere, or it's not going to be influenced by somebody else. So it does enable us to drill down a little bit more on maybe the crux of where this all began, or what's the most difficult part that they're dealing with at the moment. And then we can I work alongside a social worker. I do the legal side, they do the non-legal side. We can really try and tailor that support that we're going to refer them to and say, look, this is what we've identified, this is what they've disclosed, this is what they'd like to engage in that's going to be most helpful. And we can really try and work out, okay, what's been involved before, why hasn't it worked, or how has this family or this young person sort of flown under the radar for so long and not received any support. And we can try and work out, by hearing from them directly, what they think will work or what they find hard to engage. And sometimes it's just as simple as they've disclosed everything to us and they say, would you like us to help tell your story with you there in consult? And it's just having one of our social workers go along, to an intake appointment somewhere and help them, you know, help them have that conversation. So it's yeah, like I said, we're really unique in that we get that opportunity to have that truly private and confidential conversation with them. And then we can sort of really try and flesh out what's going to be the most helpful for them now in this particular, you know, pointy end of things when they're at court. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I think I might have gone on a tangent.
And it sort of just takes me back to some of the research and the comments you made earlier, Silvana, in terms of Georgina's presentation. You mentioned earlier an intersectional lens at the beginning. Given what Georgina said about the intersection between adolescent violence in the home and disability, what can you share with us, you know, in relation to the work that you do? How are you addressing this at Drummond Street?
Yeah, and look, I think as Ali said, it's case by case. I think we might, after a period of time of working in the AVITH space, we see some patterns, but the reality is each case is taken case by case. So I think what happens, and I think this is the important part of a really good intake and assessment process, is to identify really what the issue is. Is it the disability that the child has, and there's some complexity with the parenting, or what is actually playing out, and that results in the young person being violent. So I guess in those sorts of situations, it really is about falling back onto a really good intake, a really good thorough assessment, and then looking at how we can support all the players. And that includes the siblings. Again, I'll mention them again because often they don't get talked about, but are just as highly impacted as the research again is highlighting. So I think in each of those cases, it really does depend, you know, is there some intergenerational trauma that's intersecting with the needs of the young person with the disability, and that's triggering things? Is there about some parenting skills in some really complex transitioning processes? It really is a case by case. So we have to again take on that curious lens. It's beyond, it's not a punitive lens. It's really looking at if these behaviors aren't suiting the family and how the family is engaged with each other, then what protective factors actually exist? What can we build on? How can we restore some joy? I know that sounds really strange in this conversation, but families do need to reconnect, and we look at different ways of doing that. And also just what is actually playing out. Are the children becoming parentified because they're having to take on a responsibility? Are parents getting triggered themselves? What is playing out, and what's going on for the young person in the center of this as well? What is happening? And so I think that there's no one formula that applies to any particular intersect. It's really about responding to what is playing out for each individual family and the members within that family, and looking at what has impacted to where they are now, and then trying to unravel what supports we can put in place to support them beyond the violence. And that as Elena mentioned, that's quite complex when we're dealing with family violence that may or may not be continuing to act out, or the family law court, where legal systems are often used and weaponized. And so again, each of those systems have to be unpacked and really looked at how best we can support the families. But it's not just about emotional regulation. That certainly plays a part. It's not just about a gendered lens. That certainly takes a part of the work, but it's broadening out the scope of viewing what's actually going on for the whole family and how we can address that. And the systems issues. I guess that's the other thing I have to talk about with Drummond Street. We're a very strong social justice lens. We advocate within a systems lens. I mean, the research and the evidence is what we look at. This is supported by what little there is out there. We are supported, we encourage that. So it's that sliding scope of both a systems lens, looking at how being a person of colour and the issues of marginalisation would certainly impact on certain families and how that might be playing out, and also how that would impact on help seeking behaviours as well.
Yeah, And I guess from a systems perspective, Mina, in terms of that intersection of AVITH and disability, do you have a perspective from the Commission in terms of what can be done to improve, or how are you working with the system to improve?
Yeah, I mean, with our systemic inquiries, we make lots and lots of recommendations about how systems need to improve to be much more child and youth focused and much more trauma informed. And for Aboriginal children and young people and children from communities of colour, need to understand impact of culture and race, and the children potentially from refugee backgrounds, how trauma through parents can be impacting on them. Really, I mean, echoing Silvana's comments about really centering the child and young person where they are, but where they are in the context of their family. And for what we see often, the majority of children and young people who are in out-of-home care are in kinship care, so they're with a family member of some sort. So, we see that adolescent violence in the home aspect can be a different space in terms of not just being the immediate mum, dad, immediate siblings. It could be aunt, uncle, nan, pop, cousins. And what we see is that those kinship carers themselves aren't getting enough of the supports that they need to be able to respond often to children who are acting out because of the trauma of themselves having been a victim of family violence, and also the trauma response to being removed from their families. So it's really needing a multi-pronged approach to the different needs of everyone in the child's life, but really centering how that child is experiencing what these systems are. And, when we look at things around, we're asking some of the most vulnerable people to navigate some of the most complex systems. And we really need to rethink how it is that we engage with children and young people and with families. And we need to, understand really inherently that children and young people are fundamentally different to adults. They've got different needs, they've got different interests. Sure, there's overlap, but there's a lot of stuff that needs to be focused and specifically tailored to them. And we too often don't see their voices being heard in what decisions are made about their service delivery. And we also too often see an expectation on children to behave in almost adult ways simply because they've gone through some very adult things. And our systems expect a lot of children and young people. We expect them to be able to make decisions that and just roll with circumstances, instability of care placements and all sorts of things. We expect them to just deal with and just be able to engage, with school every day, or just be able to regulate our behaviours and everything. And we really need to get better at understanding how children and young people experience in that. And the best way to do that is to hear directly from people like who are with Create, who we do some work with, and children who've been through the systems, and understand it firsthand what does and what doesn't work.
From a practical example, there's a great question that's just come in from the audience, so we're going to start looking at those as well. This first question is how to best support a young person who is refusing service, especially if they've had bad past experiences with service and service delivery. Brianna, I thought perhaps you'd like to start a response to that, because it is, as Mina said, we expect them to do so much adult work that, what happens when they want to refuse a service?
In my opinion, you need to find out what it is that they do want. You can try and force a kid kicking and screaming to go somewhere and engage with someone, and if they don't want to, there's going to be no result. So finding out what it is they feel they need. No child, no young person wants to act out. No one wants to be bad. They're just struggling to regulate those emotions. So find out from them, what can I do to help you? How can I help you? Once you get, some idea, that's where you go from.
Michelle, I was just going to say, we have found at times that the young people have just not been involved. and they've chosen not to involve themselves, and that can happen. But we've also found that often when we engage, usually the protective parent, the mum, but sometimes both parents, I don't want to just assume that everyone is just a protective mum, that as we're working and we're resourcing them and developing their skills in that space, and we keep an invitation open to the young person, that often that will lead to, at the very minimum, a curiosity. And so that's always a good starting point to an engagement space. And so there's often an opportunity for us to invite them in and open that up. And there's often conversations about what they might want in that space. So being aware that Drummond Street really is attempting to focus more at the early intervention prevention, but just that is also our experience. So I just thought I'd articulate that.
No, that's really important. And Ali, I guess how do you best support a young person who has refused to service? As you know, you were saying earlier, it's so important that the other services sitting around the legal responses are critical for outcomes.
Yeah, as I said, it's unfortunate that young people find themselves at court, but sometimes it is that the silver lining of it is that, well, they have to come to a court date. They don't want to go through, being arrested by police again or something like that. And so they do come to court, and so they are there, and it does sort of compel them a bit more to engage. And as Silvana said, usually at a very minimum, someone might leave being very disinterested, but we've piqued some curiosity. And I think we've only ever had one young person that I can think of through a family violence program who has just absolutely refused to work with us, or with anyone for that matter. And more often than not, they will come around. And once they sort of get the idea that we are their service, Youth Law truly is that, we are their legal representative, we are guided by them, they instruct us, that really does often start to sort of turn the ship a little bit. And it is a really unique spot we find ourselves in, and it means our social workers can really kind of hone in on them specifically and tailor it from there. So yeah, I guess there's a silver lining to being at court, and that is they're compelled to come and engage in some way, and we have that opportunity to speak with them, where someone like Silvana and her staff just may not have been able to get them into a meeting ever.
One of the other questions that we've had come up a lot in the chat is, what is the role of risk assessments in preventing and responding to AVITH, and is there a potential for risk assessments to help make a difference? I don't know. Risk. Well, Silvana, I'll start with you as the
it's fundamental. I mean, it's core to constantly assess and have a lens on risk assessment from the very get-go, both for the safety of the young person, family members that are involved broadly. So our risk assessment extends to not just the young person, but all the family that's involved, and I guess, and also our workers. I mean, that's a major component of that moving forward. And I think dynamic risk is actually perhaps one of the hardest things to constantly review. It's easy to assume that things are the same from one session to the next, only to find that someone walks in and things have really quite majorly changed. So I guess that's where having a building workforce capacity around assessing that is really vital. And the tools. So in Victoria, the MARAM tool for AVITH is still yet to be fully developed. And so agencies are really either relying on MARAM, which is really, again, binary. It's either about perpetrator or as and it doesn't really encompass the breadth of what we're talking about today. So Drummond Street has had to incorporate a tool that does move beyond that binary.
You've developed a tool?
We've had to, and it constantly gets reviewed, and we're in the process of reviewing again because MARAM has had new perpetrator MARAM tools released, and so we're incorporating that. And so as an assessment tool should do for risk, should constantly keep changing and keep developing. I just think the internet is a really amazing space in that things are constantly changing and developing. So I think it's about it constantly being part of our conversation, around how we respond, how we continue to assess dynamic risk. It's got to be a pivotal component of our work for our workforce and for those that we are providing services to.
And I'll just, yeah, Ali.
I just wanted to raise one thing with risk assessments, just because it's something, again, anecdotally we get, we find so often with families, is that often the end, you know, a risk assessment and then a safety plan is developed, and often the final step is call 000. And so often the feedback we get from families who then do come to court with the young person is, we called 000, that was the last step in our safety plan, but we had no idea that this is the response that we would receive. They had no idea police would come and approach it the way they did, that the young person might get taken to the station for an interview, there might be charges and all these kinds of things. And had they known, they maybe wouldn't have got to that step, or that might have looked a little bit different. And I just would really encourage anyone who is talking through that safety plan with somebody, I would never want to discourage someone from calling 000 if they need it, if they're in danger and they don't feel safe, but just to maybe really step through with the family what that could look like, because that's a traumatic experience, not just for the young person, but for the family. And often, had they known that this is the response they would receive, they actually might not have done that, and they might have done something quite different. And once you're in the court system, it's hard to get yourself out. So if you are doing risk assessments and doing safety plans with those families, talk about that part of it, because calling 000, there's a whole flow on of what happens from there and what that can look like. So I just think it's really important to talk about that with families as well, because often they don't know, they haven't had that experience until it happens, and it's not a great one usually. There are the great police responses out there, but they're certainly not the frequent ones.
Brianna, did you have, or Nina, just on this last question, any comments that you wanted to make about risk? And I think, Ali, that's, you know, so incredibly important in terms of that breadth of risk, and also that collaborative system service approach to understanding what all of the risk for the whole family are.
I have nothing further. I agree with both Ali and Silvana with that.
Thanks, Brianna. And Nina?
I was just going to add, you know, we see risk assessments in the context of assessments done by child protection, the SAFER framework, and assessing risk in families. And the things that we see that are concerning with risk assessments is, as Silvana said, that situations can change dynamically and rapidly, and so that consistency of relationship and connection is so important, so that when things do change, there's some sort of space or person or place that these issues can be raised. And you know, also, you know, risk assessments not being you know, they're not the be and end all, as situations can change, so can the individuals with them in terms of capacity for, you know, being able to address the use of violence and address other things in the family. So they're really, especially when we're talking about adolescents who are using violence, you know, a lot of the, as Silvana said again, a lot of the tools that we're seeing aren't specifically tailored for children and young people, and when they hold that dual place of being both a victim and someone who has used violence. Yeah.
Thank you. Really important point to end on there. I'm going to invite our research panelists to all come back onto the screen, and in our last couple of minutes, I'd like everybody to think about 30-second takeaway about what it means to effectively work with children and young people in preventing and responding to adolescent violence in the home. And I'm just going to go around my screen. So it's Silvana, and then Brianna, and then Ali, Mina, Elena, Georgina, Kate, and then ending up on you, Silke. So what does it look like? What is the most important takeaway you want to leave the audience with in terms of the breadth of this work? Silvana.
Yeah, you've got an hour and a half for this, right? I think, look, there's just so much complexity in this space that I don't think there is an easy solution, and that I think the evidence is vital because it will constantly impact on the policy development around it, and that a systems alignment and a collaborative practice for us is really how we will move forward, I assume, Drummond Street. Yeah, and that intersectionality.
Brianna, what's your takeaway?
I would just say take on board the experiences and the perspective of young people, that one glove fits all is not going to work. Listen to individual experiences and tailor services to that.
Great. So well done. Thank you. Ali.
Yeah, I'd echo what Brianna just said. Yeah, really trying as best as you can be guided by the young people themselves. Remember, they've got their own story about what's happened to them, and if they're given the opportunity, often they can articulate what they need, and that may look different from the family. That's not to say you can't do whole of family work, but it is just so important to give them that opportunity. And also, you know, it's a bit corny, but hold their hand. They're finding themselves in these really adult systems, and that's especially true if they do end up at court. You know, it's not kid focused, it's called children's court, and we do the best we can, but it's an adult system, and it's really, really tough, and it does create more trauma. So you just have to be mindful of that as well when you're working with them.
Thanks so much, Ali. That nuance is really critical. Mina.
Yeah, it's really just adding on to everyone else. It's so critical to centre the child or young person's voice, their experiences, their identity, their needs, and making sure that you're taking time to build that trust. You know, often they're children and young people who have had their trust betrayed numerous times. And so you can't expect that you're going to find out everything about them in one setting, and, you know, in a clinical type of setting. You know, you've really got to make those human connections.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mina. Elena.
So many things, Michelle, but I'd say remember that you might be the first person that is telling that young person that they're not entirely the problem, that they're not just bad, or that they need to be fixed. And, you know, echoing all of the comments that come earlier and go with that, thinking about the fact that the young person might not be able to control everything. So we put a lot of expectations about young, you know, change your behaviour, and let's engage with positive masculinities or whatever it is that's happening, and then they can do all the work in the world, but then they can go home and they can't change their environment. So seeing them as a child first and foremost, because legally that's what they are.
Thank you. Georgina.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm a bit like Elena. I have so many things to say, but I'd like to echo a lot of what was said around child-centred practices and in the work we did, disability inclusive practices. Echo what Elena said about thinking about how behaviours arise in terms of the social and interactional context, not just as behaviours that sort of sit out on their own. The last thing I wanted to comment on, and this was something that was really clear in our research, is that there's a real appetite to do things better. And I think that that's really clear in this webinar, and I have been looking through these questions, and there's a high level of frustration, but an absolute appetite to be doing things better in this space. And it feels like such an opportunity to do it, to start to do things better when we've got all these people coming on and going, how do we do this? How do I do that? How do I do that? It's really terrific, and you don't often see it as such enthusiasm for change.
Thank you. Kate.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and just a huge thank you to everyone who's spoken already. It's been incredibly insightful. I think kind of following on, for similar to Mina, I was really thinking about trust and the importance of trust for young people that are disclosing to an adult or seeking support from an adult. It's because that's a trusted relationship in among many relationships that haven't been trustful for them. So really holding the privilege of that, of being a trusted person in these lives, and ensuring that you don't abuse that trust. But I also think, from what Georgina said around the appetite to do things better, I think it's so true. This is a moment, and we really need to ensure that while we have a national plan to end violence against women and children, which includes this ambitious goal to end gender-based violence in one generation, that is going to absolutely require working with children and young people. So we need to see increased investment in services, in supports for children and young people that are impacted in a range of different ways by domestic, family and sexual violence, because we know that more of the same isn't enough. We have to do things differently, and we need to invest in that.
Thanks, Kate. And Silke, ending up with you.
I'll say everything everybody else said. And I think just leaving us with remembering, and it builds on what Kate just said, remembering to really think about this much sooner. Like, of course, we need trauma-informed AVITH responses and youth justice responses and educational responses and child and youth mental health responses where we're quite comfortable picking up young people with their problem behaviors. But we know, and we have a national plan that recognizes children and young people as victim survivors in their own right. And we know that with child-centered trauma-informed early work, we could prevent a whole lot of these outcomes, you know, across the AVITH, youth justice, educational disengagement, and child and youth mental health spaces, and supporting parents and children holistically in terms of the victim parent, but also really focusing on investment in child-centered recovery early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a huge appetite, and I'd like to thank all of you, both the researchers and our panelists from the service delivery sector, for the generosity that you have shown today in terms of both unpacking the research but talking about the impact it has in your practice. I think that, you know, that's really important in terms of how we understand the incredible body of work that you have provided and the work that you do and the collaborative way in which you've come together to discuss it. Thank you. And Kate, picking up your point, yes, you know, further investment is needed, and I think there are lots of research questions from all of the research reports that and topics from this core grant round that you've all provided research into that need to be furthered going forward. Big thank you for your generosity and also your expertise and your willingness to share it. Thanks to the audience. The webinar recording will be available very shortly, and the resources are including the research reports are all in the chat. Sorry that we've gone over by 6 minutes, but I'd like to say thank you and goodbye.